Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another fun-filled episode of the 52 Must-See Movies and Why They Matter. I am joined here once again by my friend Stephen Billings. Stephen, how are you?
Hello, people. Yes, we are here to talk more movies. I don't know why I'm talking like that. I guess I just feel so sophisticated talking all these classic films we talk about. And today, with my pinky out, we're talking another Billy Wilder classic.
Yes, so far we have talked about Billy Wilder already when we did Sunset Boulevard, another absolute classic, coincidentally from the same decade of the 1950s. This film we are talking about today came out in 1959. Coincidentally, Sunset Boulevard was earlier in the decade, and this one is at the end. So Billy Wilder had a hell of a decade back in the 1950s when it came to directing movies. And the movie we're talking about is Some Like It Hot. And this movie is definitely very well known in pop culture. For those of you who somehow are not aware of it, it is starring Marylin Munroe, Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon. Those are the principal cast members of this movie. Those are the ones that are on the poster, at least. But there are a couple of others that we'll talk about when we delve into this movie. And this is just an absolute classic. This is probably one of Marilyn Monroe's most well-known films, one of her most well-known roles. I when I posted that I was watching this movie or rewatching this movie for this video, just so many people came out of the woodworks saying how much they love this movie, and I have to concur with them that this is a great movie. I know it's on many all-time lists. It's known as one of the best comedies of all time. Stephen, was this your first time seeing it, or had you had seen it before?
Yes, this was the first time. A lot of times these are my first times, and yeah, I agree, man. It's. I can definitely, especially and we talk about this a lot with a lot of these films. So influential. I mean, this movie did something that a lot of other movies later, tried to copy like so much, and it's yeah. I mean, it was a really good movie. I really had a good time with it.
Yeah, this movie is definitely well ahead of its time, especially with a kind of plot structure and certainly a lot of the themes that are in the movie and a lot of the things it does in the plot. But before we delve into that, I just want to warn everybody we will be spoiling the heck out of this movie. If you have not seen it yet, I highly recommend watching this and then watching this video, unless, of course, you don't give a damn about being spoiled. And also, for those of you who are not familiar with the plot and are sticking with us, basically, the film is about two musicians who are essentially end up at the wrong place at the wrong time, and they kind of see gangsters in Chicago do things that gangsters do, basically knock off the competition or knock off other gangsters, and they witness this, and now they have to basically go on the run, or else these people are going to find them and kill them. And what is interesting about this movie is that it is set in 1929, and I believe right before the stock market crash, or at least they don't mention it really much at all. So we're talking the late 1920s. We're talking the Prohibition era. Bootlegging is abound. So that is kind of where they run into a lot of these organized crime people, is because of the bootlegging and the speakeasies and all that kind of cool stuff from back then. Maybe not so cool because organized crime, while cool in movies and TV, at the time, not so much. But yeah, we start off right away in this film with a completely different feeling. If you had not known what this movie was about going in, you would have sworn you were about to watch a gangster picture. Steven, did you get that feeling? Because the tone in this movie shifts a lot.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Like I said, being the first time I saw it, I was like, man, this is a comedy. It starts off like an action movie, like some gangster action. It kind of reminds me of more recently, Analyze This and Analyze That. Gangster comedies, and a lot of times in them movies they're very serious. It gets very violent, and that's kind of how this movie starts off, where these gangsters are robbing this liquor, getting this liquor, and they're getting shot at by the cops, and it's pretty intense.
Yeah, the movie starts with a shootout between cops and gangsters because they are hiding liquor in coffins, and they're using a funeral home as a front I mean, this doesn't sound like a comedy to me, but but inside of this funeral home front is a speakeasy. And a speakeasy is basically a term where people would use like storefronts or whatever to kind of hide bars and clubs in the back and that would sell illegal alcohol, essentially. And in this particular sense, they called it coffee. You know what I mean? I would like a coffee. How would you like your coffee? With scotch or with whiskey or whatever? And that's how they would hide these things. And this is when we are introduced to our main characters of the film in Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. Tony Curtis plays Joe. Jack Lemmon plays Jerry, and they are two musicians, and they're kind of down and out. They are down and out. They are hidden on. They are gotten into rough times when it comes to finances. They make that readily known. How this is like their first real paying gig they've had in quite a while, and they're really excited that they're finally going to get paid. Jack Lemmon wants to use it to go see a dentist, and Tony Curtis is like, "What are you, crazy? We basically owe money all over town. We got to pay some of these places off, or or we won't be able to borrow any more money on a credit." And lo and behold, before they can get paid or anything like that, the place gets raided by police. It's a very, untouchable situation. If you're familiar with the Untouchables and Elliot Ness and all that stuff, and they have to escape, and they basically are trying to find any way they can to make money. They sell their overcoats so that they can bet on a dog race, I believe. And of course, they end up losing that money, and then they're like, and then they go to a bunch of these. I would say agencies, or almost they're looking for work. Steven, what would you call places like that? Like,
yeah, it's like a I'm trying to think of the word for it too, but it's definitely like a work placement kind of place, a place where they have a lot of different jobs for music talent agencies, like you said.
Yeah, they're basically looking for gigs anywhere they can get them. And there's this one place where there's a gig available, but they don't quite fit the bill. This place is looking for a bass player, which Jack Lemmon is, and a saxophonist, which Tony Curtis is. But they have to be women. A traveling band that is filled with women need a bass and a saxophone player, and they don't fit the bill. And right away, Jack Lemmon is so desperate that he has this plan that, you know what, we could dress up as women, we could do this. And Tony Curtis is like, this is ridiculous. This we couldn't pull it off. Essentially, I don't want to do this. This is ridiculous. And then they decide to take this other job that's like 100 miles away, and pays like $6 a piece, and is kind of not really worth the effort. And this is when Tony Curtis kind of woos the secretary of this agency office and gets her to lend her his car, and that is when we end up at the garage, and that is where we end up witnessing a crime that happens, and they're about to get killed, and they are very fortunate to get away. And it's very interesting how when desperate times come, you can to get away. So Tony Curtis is like, we're going to call up that agency, we're going to pretend to be women, we're going to shave our legs, we're going to get dressed as women, and we're going to take this job just so we can get out of town. When we get to Florida, which is where this gig is, it's like a 2-week gig in Florida or a 3-week gig in Florida. We'll just ditch it and we'll just go on our own. You know what I mean? At least we'll be safe. At least we'll get away. And then you have that scene transition where it goes from them freezing outside and concocting that plan to the train station where they're about to get on the train. And right away, this is when I find the comedy to really pick up. Dialogue when we meet these characters is great. It's funny, but this is when things get really particularly hilarious for me, because right away, realizing that being a woman is very difficult, especially when it comes to just wearing women's clothing. He's right away commenting on, man, this is very drafty. I almost feel naked. I can't believe that women walk around like this. How are they walking these shoes? And ultimately, a lot of what this film points out is that yes, it is quite difficult to be a woman in society, that women don't necessarily have it easy, especially when it comes to the way they have to dress, the way they have to portray themselves, because that is what society dictates. You know what I mean? So the film is definitely delving into a lot of social commentary, and it's commenting at a time where the late 1950s is not exactly a progressive time for women at all, let alone men dressing up as women, the transgender or that community, the LGBTQ community that we're so aware of now. There's not a lot of advocacy for that back then, especially not in movies. And pretty much you couldn't do that in movies, let alone set a movie back in the 20s and have that be in it. So I find that to be very fascinating, and I also find out how it comes up repeatedly throughout this movie. And there's an entire train sequence that ensues that I think is just pure hilarity to me. I mean, Stephen, seeing this for the first time, how much did you laugh?
Yeah, yeah. You know, the many times where, especially on this train ride, where you know, Jack Lemmon really wants to, you know, he's making it clear. He's like, look, these women are beautiful. Like, I really want, you know, like I'm having a hard time here. Like, of course, I'm not going to touch any of these women. I know I'm a girl. He says this a few times. I'm a girl. I remember I'm a girl.
There's
You
some
know,
great situational comedy throughout this scene. Even right away where they get to the train and they're hesitant about going on. At least Jack Lemmon is, and then who happens to walk by but Marylin Munroe. It's very fascinating, which is all about highlighting the objectification of women. Happens to have one of the most objectified women ever on screen. I mean, for me, Marilyn Monroe was one of the most magnetic women to ever be put on screen. She really changed the way women were viewed sexually on screen. She could literally just appear on screen and not say anything, and she would just exude a lot of sexuality. You know what I mean? And a lot of objectification resulted because of that. And a lot of myth of Marilyn Monroe has resulted because of that. We could go through a whole show about Marilyn Monroe because she's just one of the more fascinating people, I think, in cinema history. Especially the tragedy, the way her life ended, and all that kind of stuff. But in this film, she is magnetic. I think she is great in it, and right away, she is used in that objectificated way. You know what I mean? And I think it is to a point. You know what I mean? It is to make a point that perhaps women should be judged a little bit more than that, because she has some issues that are interesting in this movie, where she has been spurned by men in the past. She seems to keep falling for the wrong type of man. She's looking for a specific type of man, and she also kind of is a bit of a wild child, if you will, where she's hiding a hip flask and all that kind of stuff, which apparently is like, alcohol is extremely frowned upon for women, especially in this band, which makes the scene that they have in the train car later on, when they're all supposed to be sleeping. They have this big party, and everyone is apparently smuggling alcohol in a time where there's not supposed to be alcohol
I was
around.
going to say, yeah, because it is the prohibition time, so it's definitely frowned upon in the sense of it's not legal. So it's, you know, yeah.
Yeah, it's not something that is legal, but it's just so much hilarity ensues in this sequence. And one of my favorite, not even off the cuff by Jack Lemmon, is when he is getting on the train and he slips, and that manager guy like pats him on the rear, like basically sexually harasses him. He just turns and goes, "Fresh," and I'm like, I burst out laughing every time I see that, because he right away is seeing how women are treated by men, which makes this film shockingly contemporary, specifically now, where we're finding out a lot of the misogyny and sexual assault and harassment is happening within Hollywood. This movie is highlighting this, over 50 years ago, almost 60 years ago. It's quite contemporary because of that. But in this train car, but go back to the plot. In this train car, a lot of hilarity ensues. There's a lot of situational humor. Jack Lemmon is trying very hard to stay within the character, which he has chosen his own name to be Daphne. Initially, he was going to be Geraldine, a play off of Jerry, but he decided to make his name as Daphne, which I believe is kind of a way for him to more endear himself to this persona, if you will. And also, I think it's kind of a shout out to perhaps men who believe that they should have been women and giving them their own specific names. You know what I mean? When men make the transition from male to female, they change their name and whatnot, and appearance, of course, all that. But this feels like a lot more personal for him, and perhaps it is something that is a shout out to that. I'm not quite sure. I don't know how aware people were of that situation at that time, but I found it to be very, very just a unique character thing for him. And once we get to Florida, finally, after a hilarious party-like atmosphere on this train, right away we are introduced to one of the most funny characters I've seen in a comedic movie, I think, ever. And he steals every scene that he's in. And this is a character of Osgood Fielding III, portrayed by Joe E. Brown. This guy, I think, is hilarious because I don't know if this was done on purpose, but he is someone whom I believe to be a hidden homosexual character. You know what I mean? He's definitely effeminate, and I think he's purposely effeminate to show, to kind of hide homosexuality within film at the time. Like I mentioned earlier, you couldn't really do that overtly because it was frowned upon with the Hays Code and all this kind of cultural stuff at the time. So a lot of filmmakers decided to hide homosexuality within their films. Hitchcock did it a few times with Rope and North by Northwest, and I think Billy Wilder is doing that now because just the way the character acts is so unique to me. It gives off that type of vibe, but he's also one of the more womanizing characters of the movie, the most misogynistic in the movie, and it's almost done in a comedic way, but it's also a social commentary. Stephen, did you pick up on Joey Brown's Osgood in that way? Because I thought he's a scene stealer. This guy's a scene stealer.
Yeah, and it's very much a lot clearer at the very end of the movie too. But yeah,
yes, it is.
Yeah,
we'll get to that later.
We'll get to that. I won't spoil that yet. But yeah, it's a fun character, and yeah, I mean, like you were saying with the Hays Code and stuff like that. This was a time where basically the code. This movie is considered to be the movie that really kind of almost knocked that out. Because at the time a lot of films were pushing the limits, and then this movie right here definitely pushed the limits of what could be in a film and what a movie could talk about socially and yeah, and that's part of why this movie's in this book, I think, because it pushed the limits. It's a movie that pushed the limits, and like you said, it's still contemporary and still can be looked at today and still have relevance. So yeah, I mean, and that character, yeah, is part of that.
Yeah, I mean, the film at the time I think was banned in like Kansas and was not condemned by the Catholic League, but it got like their second to condemned rating, which is I think is like indecent or something like that. I don't know. It's not irrelevant because it didn't happen, but it's irrelevant because who cares what the Catholic League really thinks? You know what I mean? It's like, come on, this is crazy. But yeah, the film exudes sexuality. I think that's what a lot of people were afraid of at the time, and that's a lot of the reason why the Hays Code was put in place in the 30s, was to cut down on a lot of the overt sexuality that was in movies. And yet again, that goes back to Marylin Munroe. I think changed the game for sexuality in movies, being a provocative sex symbol just by her mere image. I think frightened a lot of people. I mean, in this movie, both men are drawn to her almost instantly. The Tony Curtis character ends up, pursuing her romantically throughout the movie, which it leads to some of the more interesting aspects of the movie. Definitely when it comes to Tony Curtis's acting ability. You know what I mean? He kind of does three different roles in this movie. He plays Joe, he plays Geraldine, and then he plays the guy who's the heir to Shell Oil Company. he puts on the glasses and the ascot and the smoking jacket and the hat and pretends he owns a yacht, which is hilarious to me, because he also pretends to change his voice. And he also, from what I've read, is that he basically told Billy Wilder, "I'm going to play this basically imitating Cary Grant." And I'm like, you know what? He sounds very much like Cary Grant, but even more pompous. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
he's like an aristocratic, Cary Grant. Yeah, and it's just hilarious to me, some of the scenes he has with Marilyn Monroe, because he's trying to play coy with her. You know what I mean? He's trying to pretend as if he's uninterested in her when in fact he is very much interested in her. You know what I mean? He's almost trying to play hard to get, if you will. Yeah, and it's just, and even from the first scene on the beach, where we get the title of the movie from, which rewatching it for the upteenth time, I finally came to that revelation. Where does the title "Some Like It Hot" come from? I mean, it's kind of ambiguous. So when they're talking about the type of music Marilyn Monroe's character performed, he's like, oh yeah, that's probably, it's like that movie's too hot for me. She was like, oh yeah, that music is hot. She's referring to jazz music, and he's like, oh well, some like it hot, but I prefer it classical. You know what I mean? She's like, oh, I like classical too. There's a lot of great interplay within their characters, a lot of chemistry on screen together. I mean, not just because they're two very good-looking people, but a lot of their dialogue and back and forth I found to be, while playful and played up because it's a movie, to be rather genuine. You know what I mean? And very funny at times. I mean, there's a scene later on in the movie, kind of the midway point, where um, basically Jack Lemmon's character has to be his wingman when it comes to the old Joey Brown character. Take him out dancing so I can use his yacht, so I can woo Marilyn Monroe. And it's like, and then he's trying to pretend the fact that he can't fall in love. Like once he did it and the woman died, she fell into the Grand Canyon. And ever since then, I've been completely numb to love. It's a great line where he points towards just, it's like, my heart is like, feels like my heart's been filled with Novocaine or something like that. It's a great line. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And then there's this game where basically he gets her to kiss him repeatedly to try to break this sickness or this spell or whatever. You know what I mean? It's a very sensual scene. I'm pretty sure that's the scene that really got the censors all hot and bothered. Got the Catholic League and all these other advocate leagues all hot and bothered, because it's a very steamy scene, and literally because the glasses he's wearing get steamed up.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's obvious, they could go, but only so far, because at this time, it's like, we know where this is going, but before it even gets there, we cut away from it. Like, it's like, he's trying to get her to sleep with him, like, for sure.
Right.
And it's like, all we see is kissing,
Yeah, he's not exactly, I mean, he's not this whole time he's trying to get her to sleep with him. He's trying to get her in general. Granted, his feelings are genuine. I think he's very much smitten by her, and she is smitten by him, but almost smitten by the idea of him. Him playing up to be this millionaire and whatnot.
I think by that point, though, I wouldn't say that there's like a straight up respect yet. Like, or you know what I mean? Like, I think that he finds her very attractive at that point, and he wants to sleep with her. But I think until we get to like the climax of the movie, where she's obviously heartbroken about this, the guy that he was pretending to be, basically dumping her. That's when he sees the real her, like, fully, and sees what he did when he did that. And that's where he finally kind of like feels that, the way he felt, being down and out, she's down and out too. And they're very similar,
It's very interesting how the Josephine character that he portrays is a lot closer to what he is really like. If anything, it is what he is really like. He just happens to be, dressed as a woman and acting like a woman. So it's very interesting how she already has gotten to know him, but she doesn't know it yet. You know what I mean? And he has gotten to know her through the Josephine character as well. This is almost like a conduit. Like a mediator. I mean, this Josephine character, but it's the same person.
Very, very much like other films that have been inspired by this movie, like Mrs. Doubtfire. You know, that's a movie that has Robin Williams dressing up like an old lady to be able to communicate with his kids, and in that same sense, he's able to convey things about himself and talk to his children and say things he didn't say before that he can say, you know, as her. You know, and he talked to his wife, his ex-wife, you know, like it's very similar theme, you know.
It's a very interesting comparison. I almost would compare the movie to Tootsie.
Sure, Tootsie is another good example.
Dustin Hoffman, you know, dressed as a woman to get a job, and then he realizes that women are treated very poorly in society, a la what we see in Some Like It Hot, where we see the objectification of women. I mean, everybody seems to constantly hit on the women, constantly force themselves on her. At least the men do. You know, the bellhop, you know, the guy who carries the luggage is like takes it upon himself to start hitting on the women. You know what I mean? He's a nobody. You know, he's just some like young kid who's just you know probably below minimum wage.
I almost feel like he was like an exaggerated character just for the point of saying that men are that way, can be that way. I think he was almost yeah.
Oh, him, yeah. He and Osgood, I think, are very similar because Osgood constantly talks about, you know, constantly makes sexual remarks towards Daphne. Constantly is hitting on her. He even pinches her in the elevator, and then Jack Lemmon gets all upset about it and leaves the elevator and takes the stairs instead. And and Osgood also talks about like the wives that he's had. You know what I mean? This is somebody who's kind of constantly involved with different women. He's not exactly monogamous. You know what I mean? He also has to have approval from his mother, who is also a woman. This is a guy who's got women problems in general. And it makes the end of the movie all that more interesting because he may or may not be actually interested in women at all. You know what I mean? Yeah. At least that's what the ending alludes to me. If when we get to the ending, it's fascinating from that regard. That's why I think the last lines of this movie are so darn interesting. But before we get there, just to wrap up some of the plot, you know, the bad gangsters from Chicago somehow come down to Florida, and they're there for a Friends of the Opera convention, which is basically, I think, just an Italian gangster convention that happens to take place in Florida. And the people who were after these two guys end up getting gunned down by the other gangster guys. You know what I mean? I find it so interesting how that plot is just relegated to the background until they finally wrap it up at the end, and that's where they have to prompt these two characters to run away once again. And
yeah, I would say if there would be any real, if I could say there would be any real flaw of the movie, it would be the fact that subplot is almost just you know, obviously the convenience of them coming to Florida is weird enough, but also the fact that really them characters are only there to give them a reason to want to leave town. Other than that, you know,
they're just plot devices.
It's a plot device, yeah.
They're just plot devices, and I like how the main bad guy gangster is what's he called? Spats Colombo is played by George Raft, who was basically in a lot of film noir and gangster movies back in the 30s and 40s, and he's almost basically reprising his roles from back then. You know what I mean? Because the movie's set in the 20s, you get a lot of that old gangster movie type feeling that you would see from the films that came out back then. Just a nice little like movie trivia nugget there. Also, that this is when the plot has progressed to, like Steven said earlier, the Tony Curtis's character has fallen head over heels for this Marylin Munroe character to the point where he doesn't really want to leave the situation. He's forced to leave because of what is happening, but he wants to say goodbye. He doesn't want to spurn like he has spurned the ones in the past. And Jack Lemmon pretty much tells him that, like, you know, you basically just, you know, used women before and left them. You know what I mean? What's so different about this situation? And that's where we kind of assume that that he has actual legitimate romantic love towards Marilyn Monroe's character, who is known as Sugar, which is kind of a great movie name. Her name is Sugar Cane, I believe, or Sugar Cane, and she changed it from like Sugar Kowalczyk, I believe it was, because she was like a Polish. I can think she was like her family was Polish, and Kowalczyk doesn't sound as good as Sugar Cane, of course. I mean, that's a great stage name, Sugar. So at the very end of this movie, they are escaping on the boat with Joey Brown, Jack Lemmon, Tony Curtis, and Marilyn Monroe comes out and says, "Don't leave without me." There was she knows who his real identity is now. She knows Josephine and Joe are all the same person. So the last moments of this movie I love so much. One of my favorite moments in movie history, where basically, in order to get Joey Brown to help these guys escape, Jack Lemmon's character has basically said that she will elope with him. Daphne will elope with him, and then at the end he's like, "Oh well, Daphne's trying to make up all these excuses, saying, well, your mother's wedding dress won't fit me." He's like, "Oh, we can have it tailored." He's like, and then he's like, I lived with a saxophone player for 3 years. He's like, "Oh, I forgive you." And then like the last line is basically, "All right, forget it." He takes the wig off, throws it down, is like, "I'm a man." And the guy turns to the camera, not he's off camera, slightly off camera, and says, "Well, nobody's perfect." And I'm like, that line sums up so much of this movie and so much of what this movie's about, that I just think it's absolutely brilliant. You have the idea of all of these indifferent and imperfect characters just being in this movie. All of them are deeply flawed. None of them are perfect, but they all are kind of good on some type of level, or at least good enough to the point where we don't hate them as viewers. You know what I mean? Despite some of the shadier things they do.
Yeah, you could say in a sense, by the end of the movie, that guy was the most honest of everybody, in the sense of like, if he's gay like we think he maybe is, he was just, and he maybe knew that was a man the whole time. He was just being himself.
Yeah. Shockingly, he was never the thing about the Osgood character is that he's never playing a role. He's just himself. Happens to be a dirty old man, but he is true to himself. I mean, right, and saying what you say here, perhaps he is a gay character. From the first thing he says to the Daphne character is that, "Oh, I like a woman with a shapely ankle," meaning a more masculine ankle, therefore indicating that he could perhaps be more into women who have more male features, or be into men in general. You can extrapolate from that character.
Maybe he's bisexual. Maybe
bisexual. I mean, that's something that no one in film was really exploring at the time as well. And I think that's why the legacy of Some Like It Hot still endures today, because, like we've said, it is so far ahead of its time when discussing women in society, sexuality in society, sex symbols and misogyny and all this kind of stuff. That's why it is very much an essential part of this list. If anything, I believe it's the only film in this list that features Marilyn Monroe, I believe. And if you're familiar, if you're not familiar with all of these videos we've been doing, we've been getting all these movies from this book here, the 52 Must-See Movies and Why They Matter, by Jeremy Arnold, the foreword by the late great Robert Osborne. And it's a fascinating read. It's a movie for every week of the year, and it's something that is fascinating to me, because we're seeing an interesting group of these movies come together. We're seeing some really old classics, some hidden gems, and some all-time classics like Some Like It Hot. Like I've said, this movie is pretty much critically loved for quite a while now. It wasn't initially a big hit when it came out, but it definitely had grown to have a huge following over time. In 1989, when the National Film Registry first started preserving these very important, very classic films, Some Like It Hot was part of the first 25 movies that they picked to have stored and keep preserved forever. So yeah, it's a mightily important movie. I love it. Steven, how do you? I am assuming so far that you like it, at least.
Yes, I would say I like it. It's, I'll be honest with you, just off of one viewing, it's not one of my favorite Billy Wilder movies. I think I still like Sunset Boulevard or Ace in the Hole or something like that more. But I did really enjoy this movie. It's definitely a rewatchable movie.
Yes.
And that's the best thing I could say about it is it's not something, even though it's an older film, it's not something I would say, it's just throwaway. No, the performances are there.
No.
Just having Marylin Munroe in there, you can call you misogynist or not. She's good to look at, and I think she does really well in the film too. And there's a lot of reasons to watch this movie over and over again.
There is so much to say about Marylin Munroe outside of this movie, all the things and problems she had in her life, and the problems she had while making this movie, forgetting her lines, flubbing a lot, doing a lot of takes, showing up to set late. And this was a time in her life which was very difficult for her personally. She was pregnant while making this movie. She is known for having a lot of miscarriages in her life, so having a lot of emotionally heavy things going on in her life. She suffered from depression, and I don't think she was very positively responsive to being as big a star as she was.
Yeah.
There's so much to say about her.
This is one of her last performances too, because I think she died maybe only 3 years later.
This is one of her coincidentally last performances. She had a couple of more after this. Let me see. I know her last movie was The Misfits, which came out in 1961. So this was actually the third to last movie that she completed. There was one movie she was making when she died, which she didn't complete, and they had to redo with another actress. And so, this was one of the ones towards the end. So she was not in the best state in her personal life, but she was still a wonder to see on screen. She was still magnetic. She still drew your eye in every way. And this is why I think this movie is remembered a lot, is for Marylin Munroe. I mean, originally they wanted other actors to play these parts, but I think they are so iconic now. Jack Lemmon, Tony Curtis, and Marylin Munroe, that trio, this movie have quite a legacy. You know what I mean? So I love it, and I highly recommend it for people. So to just wrap things up here, you can find me on my personal YouTube channel, Cabzilla Productions, doing movie reviews and all kind of stuff like that. Steven, where can people find your movie talking self?
You can find me on YouTube, Film Club Central. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, all of them places. Movie Man 16, and can't wait to do more of these. We got. I think we're down to about 17 more movies, 16 or 17 more. So
it sounds like a lot, but we'll get there eventually. We will get to that magic number 52 at some point.
Yeah, we got some big ones. We got some big ones. We got some big ones left over that we started out doing a lot of big ones, and we've done a lot of more obscure ones here in the middle, and now we got some big heavy hitter movies on this list that we got coming up. So
and you can find all of these here on our friend Dan Skip Allen's YouTube channel, Best Damn Movie Show, where you can find this video as well as all 52 of them at some point. So until we see you next time, keep watching those movies.
I know.